Okay, so photosynthesis is what we're going to be covering. Now, for this particular chapter, we need to understand the relationship between organisms and the environment and how photosynthesis is a key integral role of helping sustain and support this whole environment that we are aware of today. And so we're going to really understand what energy is. We did talk about this last time, just the very basics of energy. So this terminology and using of these different types of words should be familiar to y'all already. And now we're basically going to take this information and apply it. And what does it mean to have this energy conversion from one form to another in order to be usable from one organism and then transferred from one organism to another in order to create this intricate food web. Okay, so just to kind of reiterate from last week, if you were to take energy and divide it into two main categories, you can categorize it into kinetic and potential energy. Now, kinetic energy is going to think about automatically like the movement of molecules, this dynamic movement of these molecules is going to be fueled by this kinetic energy. It's the showing of this energy. And so the one type of kinetic energy that you need to be aware of when it relates to biology is thermal energy. So every time you hear thermal energy, I want you to automatically associate that with kinetic energy. The other type is potential energy. Now, the example for biology that you need to know is chemical energy. And chemical energy is that stored energy. So your potential energy, it has the potential stored in there. So thermal and chemical energy are the two energy types that you need to know for this class. When you start to convert energy from one form to another, you need to keep in mind the different laws of thermodynamics. For this class, you only need to know the first two laws of thermodynamics. The first one you've probably already heard of. It's the law of conservation of energy. And it's basically saying that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transformed from one form to another. So say you need to convert it from one type of energy to another. So if you go from kinetic to potential energy or go from potential energy to kinetic energy, and of course, all the subtypes that go underneath it. You can even go from one chemical form of energy, the chemical energy, so potential energy, to another form of your potential energy. And we're going to look at what that looks like, especially when it relates to photosynthesis for this chapter. This will also kind of relate to what we are going into next chapter, next time we meet, which is actually chapter 6. So we're backtracking a little bit there, but that's just the way that all of the professors here decide to teach it is photosynthesis and its foundational role that it plays in the ecosystem. The second law of thermodynamics is talking about when the energy goes from one form to another, when it's transformed, some of that energy will be lost to the environment. So that term of disorder is commonly referred to as entropy. Now, we did talk about this last time, just basically having this energy transformed into an unusable form of energy. It is no longer accessible to us. It still exists, but it's no longer usable to us whenever we go through that transformation. So that's entropy. Here's an example of visualization of what that would look like in terms of heat and transfer of these molecules and some things that we are familiar with. Pictured, you can see hot and cold. Remember, temperature would be that increase in your kinetic energy in a particular substance. So you have these molecules, if you were to visualize it here, that have high energy, high movement, and this one has less movement here. And so when they come together, things will try to reach an equilibrium and balance out. It'll go from high heat to lower heat. And so what you're going to see is the movement of the heat from one of those locations to the other. And so that's what this middle diagram is trying to visualize here. It's saying that this is losing heat, this is increasing heat, and then it's color coordinated. So hopefully that kind of helps as well until it reaches equilibrium and the heat is more distributed throughout. Now, the mixing disorder, the randomness, and how things get mixed up all together, that would kind of be a visualization of entropy. Now, we've talked about how substances move from high to low in so many different contexts, whether it's like high pressure to low pressure, or high concentration of solutes to low concentration solutes, or high amount of heat to low amount of heat. When we start to apply our solutes to this, it actually still follows this rule where you have your high concentration of solutes moving to low concentration of solutes. And this diffusion due to Brownian movement is actually a good visualization of what entropy would be. It's nice and neat and ordered. All the dye molecules are all together. And then as this Brownian movement continues to occur, which helps diffuse the molecules from that high concentration to the low concentration, you see the mixing of that. It becomes more disordered and less nice and neat. So that's what that visualization is here. So just to give you some background, kind of connect some concepts and understand just the basics of what it's trying to talk about for that terminology. There's this video that I included here, and it's talked about what we had talked about last week with potential and kinetic energy, and how you can have the transformation of this energy from one form to another, and what that example would be. Again, they use a bow and arrow to help illustrate this, that a drawn arrow would have potential energy. And then once there's that energy to release that energy, so that potential energy is able to convert to that kinetic energy of the arrow actually moving through the air, you're going to see the transformation of energy from one form to another, and the loss of some of that energy to the environment, such as through friction and whatnot. So potential and kinetic energy video, highly suggest watching it. It's only a couple of minutes, and it just reiterates what we talked about last time in case you need a refresher. Here's where we're taking the chemical aspect. So remember, chemical energy is your potential energy, that's stored energy, and converting it into your kinetic energy, or that movement and heat. And so you're going to see an example of gasoline. So we have a typical combustion engine inside of your vehicle. So you have gasoline, and that's going to go into your cylinders. It's going to be ignited with, of course, the introduction of the oxygen. And so therefore, it's going to have that little explosion inside of your cylinder. It's going to start to move those pistons, and you're going to have movement inside of your car. And so your car will begin to move forward, and you will also lose some of that energy because of the transformation from your chemical energy to your so with your potential energy to your kinetic energy. Some of that will be lost to the environment as heat. This sort of idea of transformation of energy from the chemical form to a usable form for whatever cellular processes also happens in the body. So we're pretty familiar with how vehicles work and how we put gas in. There's an explosion, it moves your car. It's going from that chemical stored energy in your gas to being able to move your car. We're familiar with that. And so it helps with that conversion going from one form to another inside of the body. And so here's an example here of what we're going to be going over, taking the energy from one form to another. The example that they use is cellular respiration, where you have your glucose of your stored energy inside of the bonds of your glucose molecule. So this would be kind of like your gasoline, and it goes through these chemical reactions in order to produce ATP, which is that usable form of energy inside for the cells, and you're going to see some of that energy being lost as heat. Now, we did talk about these terms again, but make sure you are aware of what exergonic reactions and endergonic reactions are, maybe some examples of that or what that would look like, a drawing, visualization, examples, something so that make sure you understand the definition whenever you see these words on what that actually means. So again, exergonic reactions, it releases energy from that transformation of that chemical reaction. So exergonic, the energy exits. Endergonic is you're adding in or storing that energy. So when you have that energy, it's entering into that molecule you're creating in that chemical reaction. So exergonic exits energy, endergonic has energy enter into it. A term that you want to make sure you're familiar with is metabolism, which is basically all of the chemical reactions that happens inside of your cell. Here's a visualization showing energy level with the exergonic and endergonic reactions. Here you can see your reactants and your products. So think about the things that are going to react with each other, the originating substances. They go through that chemical reaction in order to produce those products. So your starting molecules or your starting compounds and your resulting compounds. For your exergonic reactions, for that energy level recorded here, energy is exiting. Your reactants are going to release that energy and form your products. So you can see a decrease in the energy amount. Endergonic reactions, energy is entering. You have your reactants, and you're inputting energy and storing that energy in the products that you have after your substances have gone through that chemical reaction. Okay, so why are we even going over this chemistry type stuff in biology? Why is this relating to what it is that we're going to be looking at for chapter 7? If you were going to reference physics and ask them what is kind of the definition of life, how would you define that? It's basically some sort of system that is able to conserve entropy. So remember, it's going from a nice, neat, organized state to more disordered, mixed up. Think about your visualizations of like going high concentration to low concentration, whether that be heat or solutes or whatever. Your life, whenever it goes through these conversions, it helps reduce the amount of disorder, the amount of energy actually lost to the environment. So why is this important? Well, when you have life in an ecosystem, when you have this energy that's being transformed from one form to another, it can help start this chain reaction where you can have this interaction between one organism and another, where you have producers and consumers, and that's really what we're leading into here. You have to have energy from somewhere. And so for life on Earth, if we look at most of the life on Earth and we kind of see where all of this energy is being sourced from, how do we get the energy that we need in order to survive? Well, you can basically trace most of all of that back to the sun. Now, not everything on planet Earth can have all of its energy from the sun, and we'll get a little bit into it. But if you were just to make a guess on any organism and say, okay, where's that energy really sourced from? It's usually from the sun. And that's just because producers on Earth, the large majority of our producers are photosynthetic, meaning they are able to synthesize or produce or create sugars as your stored source of energy. So your producers can produce their own food using an abiotic or non-living resource, such as the sun. So photosynthetic producers can use the sun in order to produce its sugars for its energy. Consumers are not able to produce their own energy. They have to source it from somewhere else. And so consumers have to consume or eat that energy from that other source. So we can think about anything that eats anything else is a consumer. So my question is, real quick, are we considered producers or consumers? Kind of think about it a minute. Okay. Hopefully y'all came up with consumers, because of course, yes, we can go to the store and buy all the ingredients to bake a cake. We are producing this cake as a result of all of these mixing of these different substances. But really, that stored energy is coming like from the sugar or the flour. Those were once from living organisms. That's where they're sourced from. They're biotic source. So we are still considered a consumer. And then of course, things like if we eat a hamburger or a salad, all of those are once living organisms as well. And so again, we're consumers. Okay, so interactions in the biosphere for your ecosystems. Now, there are three main key concepts in how that relates with energy and your ecosystem. So I put them on separate slides like this. And so here you can see this key concept listed that life in an ecosystem requires some source of energy. So it has to get its energy from somewhere. And what are we going to have as our main source? Well, we sort of already prefaced this, but we have most of life on Earth. The energy source is sunlight. Now, here's some terminology that's going to be introduced here. We have autotroph and heterotroph, and then also this other term here called photoautotroph, and it's just a specific type of autotroph. Now, autotrophs, you can see the definition here. It says that they are able to produce their own source of energy from a non-living abiotic source. So this definition should look very similar to another definition that was already introduced to us a second ago. So if you think about it, look at that definition, some wording there. It's very similar to a producer. So whenever you think of autotrophs, you can think as producer as a synonym. Heterotrophs are consumers that feed on plants or animals or decompose organic material to gain energy from some sort of biotic source. So it kind of already told you here, but they consume that energy from another source, some sort of biotic source. Heterotrophs, a synonym would be consumer. Now, there's this term here as a photoautotroph. And photoautotrophs is just kind of like a subgroup being more specific for what an autotroph is. So if you were to take the word photoautotroph and break it down and look at all of its components, it literally tells you what the definition is. So photo, that part of that word means light. Auto means self, and troph means like nourishment or feeder, something like that. So photoautotrophs uses light to supply energy to itself. And then hetero, just for that terminology, if we're going to break that down, your heterotroph just has to get its food from a different source. It can't produce it on its own. Now, we talked about how sunlight is the main contributor to energy throughout the ecosystem that we'll see. And so that process of using the sunlight in order to convert it into a usable form for all these organisms, that process of conversion from sunlight to a chemical form of energy is photosynthesis. And another type of common producer or autotroph are different organisms that can go through chemosynthesis. So chemosynthesis actually uses chemicals in order to synthesize sugars. So down here, you can see an example that has these chemosynthetic bacteria. So your prokaryotes that are able to use these chemicals to synthesize sugar for energy. And you can see the general chemical formula here where it says it uses carbon dioxide, water, hydrogen sulfide, and oxygen. So your hydrothermal vents down at the bottom of the ocean where it's so dark that there's no sunlight that is able to penetrate that deep into the ocean, there's still life that exists down there. And it's really based off of these producers or these autotrophs of the chemosynthetic bacteria associated with the hydrothermal vents. So because of their ability to undergo chemosynthesis, it is able to basically start its own little food chain down there. And during this process, it is able to produce sugars, which is that stored energy, that chemical potential energy there, and then its other byproduct of sulfuric acid. Key concept number 2. Food chains and food webs are able to be used to model the flow of energy in an ecosystem. Now, when you are looking at your food chains and food webs, you should be able to see an organism and then an arrow and another organism and then an arrow and another organism, so on and so forth. It's important to understand that these arrows shows the direction of energy flow. So the energy in this example is going from this grass of this organism, and that energy is being transferred. So you see the arrow going from the grass to this rabbit. So that energy is being transferred. So again, the arrow direction is going to the next consumer, showing the transfer of the energy, and not that this rabbit is eating the grass. So the arrows are pointing this way, not the other way. Because then if it was pointing the other way, it shows that the grass is basically getting energy from the rabbit. And we know that's not correct. Food chains, think about like a whole chain with a link, with another link, and another link, and another link, all in a row. It's one single pathway for that energy to transfer throughout an ecosystem. So if you look at one pathway, so example, your grass to the rabbit to the hawk, that would be an example of a food chain. Here's another visualization of a food chain in an aquatic ecosystem, showing your producers of your different algae or your phytoplankton, and then it's going and continuing on transferring that energy from your algae to your krill, your cod, your leopard seal, and your killer whale. Again, energy showing direction with that arrows. Food webs are composed of interconnected food chains. So again, food chains is one pathway that that energy can take. Food webs is showing all of the multiple pathways that these energy can flow in the ecosystem. So if we're going to begin with the algae, we can still see that original food web here. We have our food chain here, where we have our algae, and it goes to the krill, and then to the cod and the seal and the killer whale. However, you can also see another food chain being formed here, with the algae to the squid, to the elephant seal, to the killer whale, or the algae to the protist, to the cod, to the leopard seal, and so on and so forth. So all of these single pathways, interconnected and interacting with each other, being shown by all of these arrows, forms a food web. There are different kinds of consumers. So here's some terminology to make sure you have down and understand the different types of consumers. There are herbivores. So think about herbs or plants. These, and vor means like eater. So herbivores basically eat plants. Carnivore, carna means meat, and vor eater, so these eat meat. Omni means both, so, or like everything, so it eats both plants and animals. And then here are two terms that you want to make sure not to get confused, because sometimes people get them a little bit confused. I feel like we have the first three down, no problem. But those second two, we have detritivores, and those eat dead organic matter, so things that have already died, and they come back in scavengers, right? So think about, I don't know those birds on the side of the road. I'm trying to think of what they're called, but you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so those are detritivores. And then we also have decomposers. Now, they specifically eat that dead organic matter, but they break it down. They don't go over there and consume it. They break it down into smaller substances and compounds in that process. So an example of a decomposer that's very frequently referred to would be things like fungi of different types, and also bacteria is another very common example of a decomposer. When we start looking at different organisms as a whole in the environment, especially in food chains, food webs, and then also energy pyramids, you can start to define their role in the ecosystem based on where they fall in that food chain or food web or whatnot. And so basically you can determine their position in the food chain, food web, energy pyramid based off of that order. So primary consumers, they're the first consumers. So we have our producers, and then those producers get eaten by something. Those would then be defined as our primary consumer. And then of course we have our secondary consumers that eat our primary consumers. So they're the second in line. We have tertiary consumers, quaternary consumers, so on and so forth. So it just shows that relationship between one organism and the next. It's also important that some organisms can kind of be floating from primary, secondary, tertiary, whatever, in the ecosystem, just based off of the particular food chain or trophic pyramid that you're referring to. So make sure to also keep that in mind when you're looking at energy flow in ecosystems. Okay, key concept number 3, energy pyramids, or just different pyramids, can model both energy and matter in an ecosystem as a whole. So when we start looking at the organisms in a particular ecosystem, you can look at different key aspects of that and have that visually represented by some sort of pyramid. So for an energy pyramid, you can see how we have these arrows similar to how we would see it in a food chain or a food web, showing movement of this energy from one source to another. You have your producers here, energies moving up to a next trophic level to our primary consumers. Then it goes up to the next level to our secondary consumers. And then here it only goes up to our tertiary consumer of our great horned owl. So transferring of energy and looking at these organisms as a whole with the entire ecosystem interaction in that particular area. A rule that I want to point out here when you start to look at energy transfer and what that looks like between organism and trophic level and another trophic level is the 10% rule. What the 10% rule says is that when you have that transfer of energy from one organism to another or one trophic level to another, you're going to have the majority of that energy lost to the environment just due to the different cellular processes, how it can get from one organism to the next. A lot of that is going to be given off of heat just from that digestion process and trying to break down these compounds. So about only 10% of that energy is actually conserved and received by that organism or those organisms on that next trophic level. So that's the 10% rule. Again, that applies to energy from trophic level to another trophic level, but also from one organism to a next in a food chain. Because of this understanding of how the 10% rule works, you'll also see this reduction when it comes to biomass, and then also, of course, the number of organisms an ecosystem of a particular type can support. So we have producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, very similar setup, different representative organisms for this, but same sort of thing here. What you're seeing here is a certain amount of producers. When we have our primary consumers, you can see the reduction of the amount of biomass available. Looking at those primary consumers, you move up again. You have your secondary consumers and our tertiary consumers. As you can see, the visually reduction of your levels of your trophic levels in your energy pyramid or your mass or biomass pyramid represented here. And this can make sense because if you think about the amount of energy, and it's sort of intuitive. So if we're to do this typically in class, I want to go ahead and see if we can do this together on the video anyway. What I want you to do is close your eyes and try to envision like an African savanna. Okay, so you can see the golden grass swing in the wind, and maybe you have some sort of oasis of like this little pond area or a river. You can see some gazelle hopping in the background, or maybe a zebra, and you probably have maybe a pride of lions. When you envision all of these details, it's sort of intuitive when you think about how that vision relates to your biomass and types of organisms and the food chain. Because if you think about your lion, maybe you have one or two lions or however many lions in that particular pride in your mind. But when you compare the amount of lions versus the amount of zebra or gazelles and the hopping around in the background, you're going to have a significantly larger amount of those zebra or gazelles just automatically, because we have that kind of reference and understanding of that world based off of our observations in the past. And then if you think about all the blades of grass swaying in the background that the zebra eat, it's kind of intuitive because the number of blades of grass and the amount of grass present in your African savanna is much larger compared to that of your zebras. So this holds true in that scenario as well. Okay. So this is just showing you an example of the reduction in the amount of biomass at each level. And because of that, you'll also see the reduction in the amount of energy is able to support living organisms at each trophic level. So your producers, the amount of producers that you have will decrease as you move up that trophic level because you need a certain amount of energy in order for those organisms to survive. And so you're going to see that reflected here. This is just showing a visualization of a reduction of organisms from one level to the next. And it is somewhat consistent with your 10% rule, especially with this representation here. So before I continue on, what I want y'all to think about is if you go back to your energy and where you're applying that 10% rule, sure, we can think about biomass and the number of organisms reduced. But if I start out with 1,000 kilocalories, okay, 1,000 calories at this base level, from that original 1,000 calories, how many calories will that great horned owl receive from the original source of those grasses? So if we have 1,000 and only 10% of that is actually going to be preserved when it goes from one trophic level to another, we go from 1,000 to 100. So we have 100 calories here. And then when we move up to trophic level again, we go from 100 to 10 calories. And then again, the next trophic level, we're only reserving 10% of that. We go from 10 calories to 1 calorie. So from that original 1,000 calories from those producers, that tertiary consumer is only going to get 1 calorie. So it kind of puts in perspective the movement and the importance of why that owl can't just survive off of one meal or one blade of grass, or you continue on. It needs energy and has to consume throughout its life in order to continue cellular processes and help it continue to live. Okay, so photosynthesis. We are aware that photosynthesis, some sort of energy source is needed in order to jumpstart this interaction and chain in the ecosystem. And we are aware that sunlight is the main contributor on this planet to these development of food chains, food webs in the ecosystem. So what is it? Why are we looking at it? Why are we studying photosynthesis? And what does it look like? So there's a couple of things that you need to know. Photosynthesis uses sunlight in order to produce sugars. Some key things here is that it is going to have CO2 and water that it's going to take into that plant, bring it to a particular area and go through this chemical reaction in order to produce those sugars. And just as a byproduct that it needs to get rid of, it produces oxygen. This photosynthesis, these chemical reactions happens inside the chloroplast. So we've already looked at different cell organelles. And so we know chloroplast is the site for photosynthesis. So just make sure to review that and pull that chapter's information up again if you need to. Some terminology that you need to make sure you're aware of when it relates to photosynthesis inside of land plants. Chlorophyll is the pigment responsible for photosynthesis actually occurring. So chlorophyll is the green pigment inside of your chloroplasts. Mesophyll is the type of tissue found in your leaf. So the inner portion or the inner tissues of your leaf, you can see the different kinds of parenchyma. So we have our palisade parenchyma and our spongy parenchyma inside of this particular dicot leaf. But this tissue type is your mesophyll, and this is the cell type that will contain your chloroplasts for photosynthesis. If you were to look at your chloroplast and zoom in, you can see that this chloroplast has different components, different structures. And so we have your stroma, thylakoids, and granum or grana. So what I want you to envision is get a Ziploc baggie. Inside this Ziploc baggie, I'm going to ask y'all to put a whole bunch of quarters in it. So I'm going to pass out all these quarters, and I'm going to ask you to fill your bag with quarters. So you take your Ziploc bag, unzip it, stick all these quarters in it. I'm like, okay, perfect. Now we're going to put all this hand sanitizer to good use, because I went to Sam's, got tons of jugs of hand sanitizer, and we're going to use some of this not only to maintain some sanitary options of making sure we're healthy and sanitize our hands, but also to represent the stroma inside of our chloroplasts. And so we're going to squirt a ton of that hand sanitizer into that Ziploc bag and zip it up. Your Ziploc bag that you just created is going to represent your chloroplast. The coins inside, or those quarters inside of your Ziploc bag, that is actually going to be your thylakoid. So your thylakoid are those individual coins. And then the stroma is that hand sanitizer that you put inside of your Ziploc baggie. Now your grana is plural, granum is if you have just one of them. It's just the stacks of your thylakoids that forms inside of your chloroplast. So you'll have your Ziploc baggie, and if you have little stacks of those, kind of like a stack of pancakes or a stack of those quarters inside of your Ziploc bag, that would be commonly referred to as a granum, or grana for plural. So if we look at all of this, you can see your leaf. There's just a dicot leaf from a tree. You have that leaf, you zoom in, you cut a little piece of it, and we look at that. You can see the tissues with these chloroplasts. That tissue type is mesophyll that we had talked about, and we look at a cell from that mesophyll, and you can see those nice chloroplasts. Now, in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see this image. This is a real micrograph taken using light microscopy techniques. One thing that I want to point out here is this little structure here, and that is called a stoma. Stoma is the actual pore itself that's going to allow for gas exchange. So you can see that there's CO2 entering into this little pore on the underside of the leaf, and O2 being represented as moving out. Sometimes people mistake that these guard cells around the outside as the different stomata, but your stomata are actually the pores themselves, not the guard cells. So stoma is singular, stomata is plural. Since we're on the topic, I thought I would show y'all what I've made sure to kind of include some notes in the PowerPoint. When you first pull up the PowerPoint, you may not have it automatically already lifted up for your notes, just showing that. There's a little button most of the time to show the notes, or there's also a lot of times where if you just hover over the bottom portion, you can drag it up and you can see any kind of notes that may be helpful, and I'll put some information here if that's helpful. Also, there is an option where you can print it with the notes off to the side. If you're wondering how to do that, of course you can Google, or you can also send me an email and I can see if I can help you, or just meet me after class and I can help you figure it out and how to look at that. Okay, to continue. So we zoom in to one of those chloroplasts, and you can see this diagram here representing what that chloroplast would look like with all of its components. You can see your granum of your stack of thylakoids, and then all the gooey stuff in the inside around your different thylakoids or your granum is your stroma, which would be, again, the hand sanitizer inside of your Ziploc bag. In this bottom right-hand corner, This is an actual TEM, so a transmission electron microscope image, and that has been taken. Of course, we know because it's using electron microscopy that it is going to be in black and white. So what we have here is it's been digitally colorized. So they've added color in order to highlight and identify certain structures. So we know that it has those pigments there inside of your thylakoid. So that's probably why they chose green to represent that chlorophyll to help highlight those details. This just reiterates what we had already talked about: thylakoids, stroma, and chlorophyll. But I do have a checkpoint question here. It says, how do the reactant molecules of photosynthesis reach the chloroplasts in leaves? So this, if you want to spend a couple seconds and kind of flip back at any notes or go back a few slides if that's helpful, I want you to figure out how you have your reactants, so your chemical reaction for photosynthesis. How does your reactants get even into the cell in order to get to your chloroplasts to go through those chemical reactions? Okay, so first off, for this, we need to know what our reactants for photosynthesis are. First, you have your CO2 or your carbon dioxide. So that's a gas. It needs to be able to have some sort of way to enter into the leaf for photosynthesis. And that would be your, and also it needs water. So it has to absorb this water from some sort of source in the plant. And so what would that possibly be? I'm gonna give you like a minute more. Hopefully you already know what it is, but just in case, test yourself. Okay, so in order to get the gases inside of the leaf, there are pores on the underside of the leaf, and those are your stomata. And then in order to get the water up in through the plant, it can absorb it through the roots. And then it uses different vasculature, which we don't need to know for this class. It uses this vasculature to bring that water up throughout the plant so it can reach the leaves to get to the site of photosynthesis of your chloroplasts. Okay. If you were to look at the most simplified version of photosynthesis, you can basically take all of this and break it down. Again, we have our reactants and our products. For your reactants, we know we have CO2 and water. And of course, that has to be in the presence of those pigments, and it has to have some sort of energy in order for this chemical reaction to occur. That energy is light energy, or sunlight. And then it goes through that chemical reaction and produces your sugar. So pictured here is glucose of C6H12O6. Yes, you will have to know these chemical formulas for each of these compounds. So make sure you do memorize and look at that. And then as a byproduct, it produces oxygen. Now, photosynthesis as a whole can just be referred to as a redox reaction, which is just a type of reaction that happens to have some sort of oxidation and reduction reaction for those compounds. So we have our CO2 that becomes reduced, so that oxygenation level is going to be reduced here. And so it goes from a 1-to-2 ratio of your carbon to oxygen to a 1-to-1 ratio. You'll see that. Also, for your reduction reaction, if it gains electrons, it'd be reduced. Your water molecule here becomes oxidized. So you'll see the release of this oxygen here. So that's just where that name of the reduction reaction actually comes from. And we'll see this, a better visualization of these compounds and what that would look like. We have our light energy, carbon dioxide, water, producing your glucose and oxygens. This is the simplified version of this chemical reaction. If you look at more details for photosynthesis, you can start to break it up into main components because there's a lot more steps that go from your products to your reactants to your products. And we'll be looking at the details of that. But kind of just to bring it back some, for this chemical reaction here, is this reaction considered exergonic or endergonic? So feel free to pause, make your guess, write it down, whatever you'd like. Is it exergonic or endergonic? So exergonic, the energy exits, and endergonic, the energy enters into your products. So here you can see that we have our light energy in our reactants. And then for our products, we don't have the production or release of energy. So this particular chemical reaction of photosynthesis is endergonic. We had that light energy entering into our products here. But now my next question is, where did the energy go? So first law of thermodynamics, which is our law of conservation of energy, we know energy cannot be created or destroyed. Well, we have energy here. That means there has to be energy over here on this side. What happened to it? So what you're actually seeing is that conversion of your energy, of your kinetic energy to stored potential energy inside of the chemical bonds of the glucose. So the bonds of the glucose is kind of like drawing that bow. It's storing that energy in between the bonds. And so when it goes to use this stored energy through cellular respiration, is able to kind of release that stored energy of releasing that bow so the arrow can move and it can perform different cellular functions. So there is energy pictured on this half. It's just stored in the bonds of glucose. This is an image. It obviously has a lot of stuff going on here, but this is a little bit more detailed, just a snippet more of what you're going to have to know for all of the chemical reactions for photosynthesis. Basically, if you were to take photosynthesis and look at the main things that are going on, you can take all these chemical reactions and basically split it into two halves. We have light dependent reactions and light independent reactions. So light dependent reactions and light independent set of reactions. And of course, there are other compounds that play a role in that. We're going to be looking at that. So when we first started studying photosynthesis, looking at your products and reactants and what was going on, you're trying to find a source of where the oxygen as that byproduct that's given off by the plant that we happen to breathe in, we basically had that understanding of like, oh, it's basically is going to come from the CO2, right? CO2, O2 is produced. We're just going to grab that C over there so we can make our sugars. But some work based off of C.B. Van Niel, he was working with cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria is a blue-green algae, is commonly referred to as, but it's a prokaryote that is photosynthetic, a bacteria that can undergo photosynthesis to use light to create its sugars. He was working with these cyanobacteria, and they go through a slightly different chemical process for photosynthesis. And he basically hypothesized that the oxygen or the O2 produced and for that photosynthesis reaction may not actually come from your carbon dioxide, that it comes from your water. And so these water molecules, this is kind of counterintuitive, not what we had typically thought of where our source of our oxygen came from. And so later researchers built upon that idea and basically created an experiment where they used isotopes of oxygen and incorporated it into different reactants into your experiment to see what happened and where those oxygen isotopes end up with in your products. So for the first experiment, they incorporated the isotope for your CO2 and waited for the chemical reaction to occur. And we have those isotopes present in your sugar molecules and of your oxygen being released here. In the second experiment, they did the same thing, but instead of incorporating the isotope of the oxygen in your CO2, they incorporated it in the water molecules. And when those plants interacted with this and they looked at the products, you saw that it was only present in your oxygen. So this is really informational to us because we now know that the oxygen that's released is actually coming from water. So kind of interesting there. So that's the main basis. So you just need to know C.B. Van Meel, oxygen is coming from your water, and it uses isotopes in order to figure out with those experiments. Another super fundamental scientist who did a ton of research with photosynthesis was Melvin Calvin. So should be a little bit easier to kind of memorize because his first and last name sounds so similar, Melvin Calvin. He studied really heavily, like decades worth of work, looking at light independent set of reactions. So for the two parts, we have light dependent and light independent set of reactions in photosynthesis. The light independent set of reactions is what he really studied on. So because of how much work he put into studying this, the light independent set of reactions can also very commonly be referred to as the Calvin cycle, because Melvin Calvin is the one who did so much foundational work there. Okay, so for photosynthesis, we have light dependent and light independent set of reactions. And we just learned that the light independent set of reactions can also be referred to as the Calvin cycle. When you are preparing for your exam and studying this, especially if you've this is like one of the first times that you're looking at photosynthesis in detail and using these terms and trying to understand these parts here, I would just choose one term for each of these. So either go with light dependent and light independent, or go light dependent and Calvin cycle. Whichever one you prefer is easier for you to use. Just make sure you have one straight in your head, and then it'll be easier once you have that down to say, oh yeah, by the way, also this information, you know, I had that in there. So here's some comparing and contrasting. The site where your light dependent set of reaction is occurring inside of your chloroplasts is in the thylakoids. So remember the coins inside your Ziploc baggies. For your light energy, it's going to be needed. Of course, it's light dependent. It's dependent on that light being present for those chemical reactions to actually occur. And then also it uses ATP and NADPH. We'll talk a little bit more about that. In the light dependent set of reactions, there's no sugar that's produced. What is produced is the oxygen. So no sugars produced. We have our input and our output for this. I made sure to bold the things that comes from an outside source, so that way you can make sure to differentiate that. These other substances will actually cycle back and forth, and you'll see that in our visual a little bit later on. So input, things that are going to be taken in, needed from outside of the plant for these light dependent set of reactions to occur. It needs, of course, light, but also it needs water for this to occur. And then the thing that's produced in this particular portion of photosynthesis is oxygen. For your Calvin cycle, or your light independent set of reactions, this actually occurs in the stroma. Your stroma is that hand sanitizer inside of your baggie, the fluid, the thick fluid inside of your chloroplast. It is in this stage where you have carbon fixation, meaning you're taking this CO2 and changing it into an organic molecule. So it's fixing this CO2 in order to produce sugar. So we have our sugar produced in this set. Your input, the thing it's taking from outside of the plant, outside of the chloroplast, is the CO2, or the carbon dioxide. So think about your stomata at the bottom side of your leaves, gas exchange, you're having the CO2 enter into the plant, going and traveling to the site that it's needed to, which is your stroma inside of your chloroplast. And then your output, which we already know, is that the sugar is being produced. And again, these non-bolded substances cycle back and forth. So that is the simplified version that we've already looked at, we've already seen, of our reactants and our products. But the more complex version is we have our light dependent set of reactions, our light independent set of reactions. You can see how light and water is needed for this set of reactions. It produces oxygen. And for here, CO2 is the input for the light independent set of reactions for your Calvin cycle. The CO2 enters in from the outside source, and this is the step that produces the sugar. So that's kind of interpreting what it is that this image is trying to show you.